Welcome everyone. This is our fourth and final episode in this series of In the Basement. And tonight we're touching on a topic which is probably more difficult in many ways to talk about than any of the others. We can pretty readily identify fear and anxiety. We're pretty familiar with guilt. But shame is something that we don't talk about a lot. Yet shame is perhaps, of all of those emotions and responses to social and other pressures that we find, shame is perhaps the most demanding, challenging, and in some ways the most destructive thing that we face. And so I want to encourage you tonight to think about what we're talking about, but also to open yourself up to what this might mean. I think we've been together for a number of weeks now. Perhaps those watching at home or elsewhere have been together for a number of weeks and have learnt to trust one another a little bit. And as we come to share stories, just be confident to let that vulnerability come through, because shame, like the other emotions we've been speaking about, thrives on secrecy. It thrives on judgmentalism and a negative judgment in the eyes of others in particular. And shame thrives on criticism. But where the deepest secrets are, that's where the most shame lies. And in some of the Old Testament passages in the Bible, people not just talk about the heart, meaning the innermost recesses of a person's identity, but their secret heart, right in the very, very depths. And in that secret heart, there are things perhaps we've never revealed, and I do not think that we need to just go doing that willy-nilly by any means. But there is a sense in which some of those things in that very deep place have a very strong shame attachment, which can be easily triggered, and we'll be talking about that a little tonight. And as with the other subjects that we've been talking about, it is very appropriate that we are meeting in the basement, because that's often where we think we belong or want to go when we're feeling shame, because shame wants us to hide. A response to shame is to hide. It wants to be out of sight. Shame comes to us in a way that makes us feel ugly, that wants to shrink away from the gaze of others. Because if guilt is all about behaviour and our response to breaking a standard and a response of conscience internally, shame is really all about identity. If guilt is about what we've done or not done, shame is really all about who we are, or more pointedly, who we aren't, and who we aren't in the eyes of others. So shame is really all about being seen. Shame is linked to being exposed, but exposed to the gaze of others. It's about being in the spotlight, but not in the spotlight in a good way, not by your invitation, but in the spotlight that the SS might have used when they were interrogating you. That sort of spotlight. That's what it feels like to be in shame. And just like guilt, there's an internal aspect, what's happening internally to us, and an external aspect. You know, we spoke about that last time, that a person externally may be guilty or not, externally, no matter what their feelings are. And internally, those internal feelings might correspond to that or not. So shame has an internal and an external aspect. There's this sense of feeling ashamed, but also a sense of being put to shame. And those two things are very closely related. If you can just follow this statement for a minute, it might take you a second to get your head around it. It's not as simple as thinking, what do they think of me? It's, what do I think of myself if they think that of me? It's a self-evaluative, self-judgmental, self-critical opinion with very strong emotional attachments, depending on the opinion of others. Now we're entering into a world which is filled with opportunities for shame. Facebook, Instagram, body shaming. It's all about image. It's all about preserving that image in the eyes of others. It's all about style rather than substance. We're in a world now which has opened itself up to shaming in many, many different ways that didn't exist even 10 years ago. So I'm just going to throw to Kirsten now to ask a couple of questions, medically and psychologically. How do you recognise shame? What are some of the physical symptoms and interpersonal effects that shame has?
Well, as you said, shame is a really complex social emotion. The root word of shame is from an Indo-European word, cam or kem, which means to hide or to cover up. So shame involves feelings of humiliation and the desire to cover up, to hide one's face, to sink into the ground. Social psychologists talk about shame being part of the social warning system or social threat system, so that some people feel that shame is a way of activating a sense of warning or social threat. So essentially what we need as humans is, or what we seek for is safety. So inside we ask the question of ourselves, am I safe and am I loved? So really whatever situation we walk into, particularly a new situation in which we're not familiar, underneath a lot of our actions and anxieties, you'll hear yourself asking the question, am I safe? So perhaps think of going to a party where you don't know anybody, and you walk in the room by yourself because the person that you're going with has had to cancel. So there's anxiety because of the social threat, and you think, am I safe and am I acceptable, or really will people love me? And we think we start those thoughts from a very, very early age, and that's where some of the ideas about attachment theory come from. But in terms of that social threat warning system, when social threat is activated, it activates the same pathways in the body and mind as pain does. So physical pain, which is interesting. So cortisol is released, which is a stress hormone. Our blood pressure tends to go up, pulse rate tends to go up, proteins or cytokines, which are pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can increase things like autoimmune conditions, so lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, pain, fatigue, they are all kind of mixed in this sort of inflammatory soup in the body, which leave us feeling tired and easily worn out. So they're some of the things that we see when shame is activated. The other aspect, I suppose, is, as I said, that desire to want to hide, but we do find that our cognition is blocked. So if you perhaps think about, again, something that people fear a lot, so public speaking, but especially in a crowd where with which are very unfamiliar, you'll find that you might have trouble finding words, and you might even have trouble hearing and actually processing what's going on around you. And so you have trouble thinking and you have trouble speaking clearly. Sometimes just during everyday life you might notice that in a stressful situation you have something called thought blocking, or you struggle to get words out, or suddenly you've forgotten what you were going to say. So part of that can be a response to shame.
It's interesting. we've had trouble with our credit card and debit card over the last 24, 48 hours because the bank cancelled our access to our credit card. The reason being that they picked up a fraudulent transaction in America on an iTunes account, and we don't subscribe to iTunes. It's part of a scam that's going around. But the shame and embarrassment when you present your card and it's declined, and then to double that, the debit card, the other one, when they cancelled the one, they made a mistake and cancelled both, so we had no access. So he couldn't pay for anything, couldn't pay for petrol, couldn't pay for groceries, couldn't do anything. Nearest branch is 40 minutes away because the one in Newry's been closed, But the shame associated, and when we're trying to talk on the phone, exactly what was happening, I felt so embarrassed as though it was somehow our fault that this had happened. And then you don't know what to say to the poor bloke on the other end of the phone.
And standing in the queue, when you've got a whole line of people behind you trying to make a purchase, and you feel like saying, look, I really do have a job, and I really do, I do have money, and the people behind me were embarrassed for me, so they all disappeared, and which is very kind of them.
Yes, that's not because you're swearing so much. No. Just to follow on from that then, a lot of research has indicated that shame has a very close correlation with destructive behaviours such as self-harm, eating disorders, addictions, even suicide. Do you have any thoughts about why that close correlation might be there? What's going on? You don't get that close correlation, say, with feelings of guilt so much, but certainly with shame you do. What do you think's happening?
Well, researchers have been able to connect that shame is really about an undermining of your worth as an individual and an undermining of your identity. And sometimes the humiliation that's experienced with that is so great that it actually leads a person to turn in on themselves. There are probably two aspects. There's one which is just a horrible self-destructive force which seems to be unleashed in some people when they're experiencing intense shame. Those feelings of self-destruction can begin at a very early age or can be rooted in early life experiences, although not necessarily. So I think one aspect is self-destruction, that we sense that judgment, and judgment is always linked with punishment, and we turn in on ourselves and attack ourselves. There is another understanding of shame through a model of therapy called internal family systems therapy, and the idea of that is that eating disorders and addictive behaviours and even self-harm and suicidal thoughts are in fact in a way of protecting ourselves, that perhaps we can see that there are different aspects to ourselves, and we think that there's a protector self, and that the protector self will exile other selves which we think are disgraceful or unpalatable or are going to actually somehow, by their revelation or intrusion into consciousness, they're actually going to be so painful to us that they're going to destroy us. So sometimes the protector self, in trying to create so much havoc, will lead us to eating disorders, for example, where we become so focused on food and laws and rigid behaviours or on self-cutting that the other stuff that's kind of been exiled is no longer in the picture because we are so intently focused on something else. And again, of course, it's not really that protective, but the problem is that it becomes a vicious cycle because then we become so out of control with those behaviours, and so the humiliation is reinforced, and the that idea of social shame is reinforced, that it creates problems of its own.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of these things in a minute, and in particular talk about shame triggers and so forth. What triggers it for you, for us? Around the tables now, to the degree that you're comfortable to share this, what happens emotionally, physically, when you feel shame, and what happens in terms of relationships? Let's just spend a few minutes talking about that around the tables, and then we'll come back. Let's bring ourselves back together again. And what's been happening around your tables? Who's able to share something that's been going on there?
Somebody said they would withdraw when they were shamed, and somebody else said they would come out swinging.
Okay.
So anger and
Yeah. What, can you comment on that, sweetie?
Oh, just that's shame is, I suppose it's like many flies in a spider web. They're all, you move one and you move the centre and they all jiggle. So there's shame, anger, humiliation, that fight or flight or freeze reflex. So anger is entirely expected where shame is involved, and that coming out swinging to try and prove yourself and justify yourself and punish the other person, as opposed to trying to punish yourself.
One of the hallmarks of shame is blame shifting. We talked about that in terms of self-justification, but that's very much the case in putting off shame by blame shifting. Now, of course, people in this room never do it. We are the exception which proves the rule. But in one of the biblical stories we'll be looking at tonight, the blame shifting is really, really clear. We'll come to that a little later. But thank you for that. Other comments? Anyone else? Other comments?
Sometimes we say, we just do this job, or it's just me here, that we're putting ourselves down when there was no need for it. And also, what was the original comment or incident that caused all that to happen? It's interesting to think, what was that thing that started it all?
Thank you. Very, very helpful. We all have an internal monologue happening all the time, don't we? And or do we not? Some sort of commentator on us, watching us, commenting on whether we've done well or poorly, passing a judgment on us. Are we pleased with that or are we not? And that internal monologue, when we're shamed, is entirely destructive, because it's no longer just commenting on what you've done, but who you are. You're stupid. What an idiot. What a waste of space you are. How could you be so stupid? Now, I don't know if anyone else has that sort of internal monologue when they're shamed. We won't ask you to put your hand up one way or the other. Thank you, Holly. Go ahead.
But sometimes, and it's something that someone pointed out to me years ago, that if you actually talk aloud to yourself, like I know, I've caught myself thinking, oh, that was silly, oh, that was stupid, but I never compliment myself. I always put myself down when I speak out loud about things. When I'm alone, it's not always people around.
Yeah. Yep. Me too. Do you want to comment, Kirsten?
Oh, look, it just makes me think of a book I was listening to called Life Together by Bonhoeffer, and he says that really none of us can ever live by our own words or thoughts and deeds, and what he means is that we can only really live by what Christ has done to us, and that we're a redeemed person, because we will either be full of pride because we've ticked all the boxes and we've done so well, or we'll be in the depths of despair because we've failed again. And we just hover between the two. There's really, if we're trying to live by our own words and thoughts and deeds, we are kept in this vice-like grip that is just a prison.
Yeah, there has to be something in relationship to God which is an external thing. It's not just an internal evaluation.
Because there's really, as you're talking about that experience of shame and the result of that negative internal monologue that sometimes escapes, you foolish girl, or you stupid person, or you should have known better, or not just I did a bad thing, but I am a bad person. That's not. It becomes like a free floating entity. It's no longer attached to reality. There's nothing objective about it. It just takes over. It's like I'm a bomb and shrapnel that's just all over the place. And it's got no ties to reality.
People talk about shame triggers sometimes, and I wonder if you could comment about what they might mean by that, and if there are such things as shame triggers, where they might come from. But moving on from what the triggers are and how they work, where's the path out from it? What's the exit, or is there no exit?
Look, I think, medically we tend to think, in categories when we're trying to understand something, and we think what's the biological, and then the psychological, and then the social reason or triggers for shame. So biologically, I suspect, even though I've never seen it written, that perhaps there is some genetic vulnerability to certain shame triggers. The only reason I suspect that is that there's an idea that with certain phobias, perhaps phobias that have been there from the day dot, that you just, maybe an infant that's never ever seen a spider before, from the very first day, that they are just terrified of spiders, and it seems to be completely irrational. So there probably is a genetic predisposition to phobias. So we're not talking about phobias, although shame is associated with fear. But I suspect that for some very fixed and just shame triggers that just seem to have been there for as early as you can remember, perhaps there is a genetic predisposition to that. But certainly psychologically and socially, I think there's a combination of very early experiences which we tend to internalise. I have a friend who's middle-aged now, but their grandmother used to say, "Oh, you wicked girl," and that was just something that grandmother said back then. But that becomes internalised in us if we're vulnerable to that. But again, I wouldn't want to think that we just blame grandmother for all of our problems, because we're the ones that are carrying the suitcase of that baggage. We're the ones that have accepted that and for whatever reason wanted to integrate that into ourselves. But in terms of the way out, I think it's tempting to think you've got to go back into the past and go into that secret heart and unravel everything and somehow get all your dirty washing out. And a lot of psychotherapists probably do operate like that, but a lot don't. But in terms of family therapy, I think a very helpful notion is that we don't really need to go back into all of that, because our memories are so subjective. We can't remember what we ate for breakfast yesterday, let alone what happened when we were 5. But we can say in one regard, so what is it that's the barrier? What is stopping us from moving forward and from being free from this overwhelming shame response or trigger about our body image or our weight, or about being not having handyman skills when the neighbour down the road is so good at building houses, and perhaps you can you're good at writing reports, and maybe people in your life have said, oh, you're useless, what good are you? But so how do we get out of those triggers? And I guess part of it is just thinking, so what are the obstacles in the way? If that obstacle wasn't there, if that obstacle was removed, what is that obstacle that's keeping us trapped in that? And look, I guess really biblically, the Bible in Romans says that hope in Christ doesn't disappoint us, or it doesn't make us ashamed, because the love of God has been poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. So it's not love. We talked about, am I lovable? And when we feel that we're not lovable in a social situation, we feel intense shame. When we feel rejection, public rejection, we feel shame. But it's actually the love of God that's been poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. It's not our love, it's God's love, and it's not us that pours it into our hearts. It's the Holy Spirit through, the triune God. So when that's poured into our hearts, when we receive what He's done, then we're not ashamed.
Yeah, we'll come to that, I think, because all of us here in this room would have that sense of being related to God in that way and knowing the love. Yet we're all also confessing the fact that we do battle with this sense of shame. So on the one hand, there's something true and objective, yet in our own experience, there is this daily struggle, isn't there?
And look,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that's, we were talking a little bit earlier about what Bonhoeffer says, that each of us needs to be completely disillusioned with ourselves. We have this idea, we have this ideal, like this, it's basically an idol, but we have this ideal self, or what he calls a wish dream of what we think the church should be like and what we think we should be like as Christians. I shouldn't be angry. How could I have said that at the bank teller when everybody was around, and I'm supposed to be a Christian? And I remember I used to have a car and it had the stickers on the back, I believe in Jesus, and I took the stickers off because I was such a bad driver. And so I thought people are going to think that's such a terrible witness because I was tailgating and cutting people off. And so so he says, and then you can really lacerate yourself and attack yourself for failing. But he says that's actually where true life is born, in getting rid of those illusions about who we should be, because they will kill us. They will just drive us into the grave. So that's, yes, there is the truth that we hope, that God's love has been poured into our hearts, and there's the same truth that, yes, we feel that we have so desperately failed and stuffed things up and we're not who we should be, and that's the answer, that we're not who we should be. And praise God, because God didn't come to people who should be, He came to sinners like us.
Yeah.
And He loves us in our shame.
That's right, and He wasn't ashamed of us.
He wasn't ashamed of us. And that is, over years of pastoral visiting, and Adrian might identify with this, you get to know people in the ups and downs, the joys and then the sorrows at a funeral, and you see the photos on the mantelpiece, and here's my daughter so-and-so, and she's a lawyer in Canberra, and this is my son so-and-so, and he's a brain surgeon, and there's the other one. He didn't come to anything, and he's ended up sort of drinking his life away and becoming a wastrel and a scoundrel, and he's the one of whom we're ashamed. We take pride and glory in the other ones, but that one. And one of the most marvellous pronouncements in the whole of the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, is where it says in Hebrews, He is not ashamed to call us His brothers and sisters. That somehow I, who is that one, He's not ashamed. He doesn't put my photograph facing the other way from the others. He's not ashamed of us and embraces us. But we'll come back to that after the break. Well, welcome back after the break, and we're still talking about shame and its effects. There was a very interesting and helpful question over the break, so let's go to that just now, if we can have that summarised, and then we'll have a bit of conversation about that before we move on. Please.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering whether or not we have the capacity as humans to lie to ourselves, to actually hide our shame from ourselves so that we effectively do not feel shame.
It's a very helpful question, isn't it? Kirsten's going to make a few comments in a minute, but just before we do that, in relation to this, essentially shame is the search. The escape from shame is the search for honour. So in all societies, to avoid shame, you gain honour. So to gain honour, to gain glory, is to avoid shame. And to be in shame is to be isolated and ostracised. It's the opposite of having a position of honour and glory. It's to be debased and to be rejected and isolated. So culturally, societies express that status and that honour differently, but those things are still in play no matter what. And we'll come back to that in relation to this question in just a minute. Kirsten, what were you going to say?
Just that I was reflecting during the week on Romans, where it says God gave them over to a depraved mind to be filled with all manner of darkness or badness, and them it's easy to think they're pagan heathens out there, but actually he seals it up pretty well in Romans, and it's all of us. So from the time of the fall, when we actually wanted an improper honour for ourselves rather than to worship and honour God and therefore be our true selves, we wanted to take that for ourselves. So God gave us what we wanted. So he gave us over to a depraved mind. And when I was reflecting on that, just the words mean that we're actually without God, without that revelation, we're in utter cognitive darkness. So what we now think of when God's given us over to that, what we think of as good, as true, is foolishness. And it says that we're filled with that. So what that means is that there's no part of us that's good, that can conceive the truth. So that God says that he sort of did the great reversal. He used what we think of as foolish in sending his son, who is weak, who is crucified by the world's standards, and that actually broke us out of that complete cognitive darkness and chaos. So, really we see, as we were saying earlier, that people can do all sorts of things, and we ourselves can, and have no subjective sense of shame about those things, but that's because our consciences have been seared and we're really upside down people.
There's an interesting study done some years ago in America amongst inner city drug dealers, and the surprise finding was that some of the most successful drug dealers had the highest levels of self-esteem, because they'd actually succeeded in a very competitive landscape, and they'd achieved a lot of honour and status, and even crimes and misdemeanours were badges of honour and status. So you can gain honour and avoid shame in a situation by doing stuff which is completely wrong and immoral and illegal, but that avoids the shame in that social context of being a loser. Can you see what we're saying in that? So this whole question of shame and honour is very culturally related. And as Kirsten was just saying, the strange thing about the revelation that God gives to us in the Bible is that his standards of honour are quite different from our standards of honour. So the things that he takes honour in are very often the things that we're ashamed of. So the weakness, for example, of the cross, the suffering of the cross. This is where you find the wisdom of God. Whereas naturally speaking, we think, well, God's power must be manifest in some great way, some glorious way. But the glory and the shame in the cross are the one thing. Just around your tables, we're going to start tapping into a couple of passages which talk about these things. The first one is from the Old Testament book of Genesis. It's the first book in the Bible. And I remember once being called to preach at a certain place, and I'd just been given a new Bible to replace the old one which had worn out. And the night before I stood to preach, I had this dream that I couldn't find Genesis chapter 1 in my new Bible because I didn't know where it was. But we're going to Genesis chapter 2. So around your tables, if someone could read Genesis chapter 2 verses 23 to 25, and then also someone else read Genesis 3 verses 7 to 15. Now I know we're breaking into the text and there's all sorts of comments that we could make about the surrounding context. We're not going to do that just now. But just read those two passages and think about comparing and contrasting them. Compare and contrast those two passages in the light of some of the things we've talked about this evening. So just take some time to do that. We'll come back together to share some of our responses after a little while. Comparing and contrasting those two passages in the light of the things we've been talking about this evening. Who's got a couple of comments?
Well, the first one particularly, there was no shame in the first reading.
Why do you think that is?
They were still perfect, were they?
Yeah, we can press on a little bit closer to that though.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that it says, it was all about the bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. So it was talking about the body in that way first, and then it said about their nakedness. So I wasn't sure if there was a link there. But they weren't shamed until they realised, oh, we're naked. So not until they're aware, there was no shame, but because of that one comment or one thought, then they had shame.
You're picking up some really good links in the passages. Did you want to comment, sweetie? You were just saying something?
Oh, I was just reflecting that it seems to be about relationships, so that sort of being the right way up, as we talked before, rather than being upside down people whose minds are just cognitively dark and sort of muddle. Being full of light and right way up people is about right relationships and free and open relationships with just completely, imagine a world like that, completely, don't mean uninhibited disinhibited in a bad way, but completely free and open with nothing that you've done or said, nothing in your past that's going to jump out and grab you. And they were like that with God and with one another. The story is actually all about
other person-centeredness. See, when you picked up the combination of bone and my bone, flesh and my flesh, meaning they are utterly connected relationally, so that my whole identity is not all about me protecting something. I'm completely focused on the other, so that my self-regarding introspection, which is where the shame comes from, the idea of being perceived in the eyes of another, is not an issue, because I'm actually totally focused on that other person.
And you can only be that because you're filled yourself.
Yeah, so in the original situation, each was filled, so they were not trying to get something from the other, but being totally other person-centered. There was no need of shame. So remember, we spoke earlier about that remarkable verse where it says of Jesus, he was not ashamed to call us his family, his sisters and his brothers. It's because he's so centered on us. He's not thinking about what he's like. He's not worried about the evaluations that others bring of him, because he's so other person centered. And of course, what happens in the second part of the story, in the second reading, is that all of that's reversed and they become acutely self-centered rather than other person centered. Any other comments about those passages, comparing and contrasting? Yeah, over here.
Yeah, my comment would be, surely there was no shame, because there was nothing barring them with their relationship with God also, not just each other. And so when that all got messed up, everything was upside down. And I suppose I've always seen it more from that point of view, but that's why they're at ease with each other, because they're at ease with their maker.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, very helpful.
I heard or read in a popular book at the moment, somebody was a little bit scathing of the idea that God would say, "Where are you?" as if God didn't know where Adam was. But I think really the "Where are you?" is perhaps a bit rhetorical, because Adam had no idea where he was, so he was by that stage completely lost. And so where are you? Who are you? Do you know where you are? Perhaps even a little bit of a centering voice for Adam, and perhaps the first revelation of truth to him, that he actually didn't know where he was. He didn't know what he'd done. Didn't know the can of worms that he had opened up. It's not that God had lost him. Like, whoops, where's he gone?
Yeah, it's a bit like a parent sometimes might say to a young child, "Where are you?" And they're hiding, and you know where they are. They know that you know, but it's an interesting relationship, doesn't it? Because it just opens up the possibility of some communication and self-disclosure in a really helpful way. Yes, at the back.
I've had another spin on that too, and I wonder about it. It's a pain cry. Where are you? It's all lost. Everything's now lost. Where are you? What have we done? It's a parent crying out in pain. What's been lost? I don't know why I resonate with that. I didn't mind the idea.
That's right, and when you say that, it resonates with Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry of lostness, that cry of the Son to the Father and the Father to the Son.
We're going to come to another passage shortly to explore some of these themes a little bit more, but one of the areas in which shame is often generated is within families. Families often become the seedbed for shame, and many of the issues that become shame triggers for us as adult people start in our very early family of origin experiences. I wonder if you could talk for a little while about family systems, shame generation within family systems, and how the gospel relates to all of that, how you as a Christian doctor and psychologist relate to that. Yep.
So we often see that families where shame is ubiquitous have a secret, so the skeleton in the cupboard, that the tightly held secret that's not allowed to come out. And then really that secret is becomes like an abscess, and it just festers and it's painful, and people walk around on tiptoes, afraid to cause any problems, and it's a very rigid sort of family system where that's in place. Another thing that we tend to see, we know about something called a double bind, and we see that in families, and that's perhaps where there are unspoken rules. So nobody quite knows what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, and you're fearful really of doing the wrong thing, but no one's ever said to you what the wrong thing is. And so you only find out by breaking those rules, and maybe an unspoken rule, you get the impression perhaps as a young boy that it's wrong and it's weak to hug a parent. But at the same time, a parent or a mother might say, come here and give me a hug. But you've been taught somehow that it's wrong to do that. So you're in this double bind, so that the mother may have said in the boy's hearing, how weak boys are for wanting to hug their parents, but mum says, come and give me a hug, it's your first day of school. So there's this double bind that's set up, and the other thing that sort of cinches that double bind is that nobody's allowed to speak about it. So the boy can't say, hey, look, I'm finding this difficult because on the one hand you're saying come here and giving me a hug, but on the other hand I get this sense that I'm weak if I do. So you can't say that, because that's another unspoken rule, that actually we can't talk about our feelings, and we can't we can't make I statements. I feel ashamed when you say that, or I don't understand that, or that's confusing to me. So that leads on to just that difficulty with ever making I statements, and really ever differentiating from a person in the family. So we see that children are really not allowed to speak up or to have their own opinions. So they need to be silent, and they're not allowed to challenge, not allowed to say no to authority. Tied in with that again is this something called coding, which again we see that there are unspoken rules, and we never quite know what they are, and we're never allowed to really say what our needs are for fear of rejection, because we're taught that we need to be in control and maintain control, but the other person, parents or siblings, they are also intensely controlling and need to maintain control because they're so fearful of shame, so that we only speak in a very roundabout way about what we want. So a wife who's grown up like that might say to her husband, gosh, it's a lovely sunny day, wouldn't it be nice for a drive? And the husband, who's got no idea, might be sitting in his chair reading the paper saying, oh, it is a lovely day, it would be a nice day for a drive. And at the end of the day, the wife's extraordinarily angry because she's tried to communicate, she wants to go for a drive, but actually she hasn't been able to say what she wants. And so there's just these kind of waves of subterranean emotion that are rippling and clashing against one another because people aren't able to say what their needs are for fear of rejection. So that's just some aspects of how shame operates in a family.
But is that a sentence like, oh, that's my family of origin stuff, therefore I'm doomed? Or is there some sense in which there's a way to be free from that, to be a more positive, in a positive set of relationships?
I think it's certainly difficult, and probably perhaps an easy stance is to say, yes, well, that's the cards I've been dealt, and that's just me. But again, I think we mentioned a little earlier before the break that there's probably a lot of blame shifting involved in that, and we can really cling on to that family of origin stuff because it's much easier to do that than to take responsibility for actually how we're going to live our lives. But I think we can acknowledge that, and we can live, as we said before, not by our own actions and deeds, but actually by as a redeemed people, not as a perfect people. And it's really just when the gospel comes and we're free to say, yes, all those bad things, they're all right, actually. Yep. And what that mother or father or sibling who we've felt that we can never be ourselves, because you're always you just have this feeling that that other person is judging you all the time, and you can't even talk about the garden without that sense of competitiveness and judgment that, you know, your plants haven't grown and theirs have grown, or, you know, whatever. But actually, you know, we can get out of that self-justification, or in fact we are led out of that, just like the exiles were led out of Egypt. And we don't need help, we need to be saved.
So we're going to turn to a longer passage now. This is from the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. And you might like to take it in turns to read around your table, or for those at home, you might like to read around a group. It is a story of honour and shame, and cultural expectations of honour and shame, and the way in which God reverses cultural expectations of honour and shame. So just read that through and think to yourself, what are the normal standards here of honour and shame? What's being reversed and how is it being reversed? So what did you find? What did you find in the story about honour and shame reversal and how it happens? What's it about?
Well, I guess the Pharisees and whatnot certainly want to shame the woman. She's sinful. To bring about shame for her, and she shouldn't be doing what she's doing because she's so bad and they are so good.
But it wasn't clear as to whether or not she was feeling any shame. You know, she obviously she would have been hearing them talk about her as being a sinner, and probably had been spat on and all sorts of stuff had happened to her out in the street. But you know, she just went about doing what she was doing without really. There didn't seem to be shame in what she was doing.
Seeing that other people were more ashamed on her behalf than she was.
Although
Sorry, over here. Yeah.
I thought that the fact that she was liking and doing, like you were saying about kissing his feet, like the feet is the most dirtiest part. Normally if you want to kiss somebody, you kiss them on the cheek or their hand if you feel you can approach them in that manner. But she knew her guilt and her shame of herself, and so she took the least, which would have been his dirty feet, a bit like the Bible verse that, you know, even she'll take what you'll give to the dogs. Well, I'll take your feet because I'm not worthy of anything else. Is that?
Well, yeah. And anything else? That culturally, there's some really significant things happening here.
Well, washing with the hair was most probably way out of line, wasn't it? For a woman to undo her hair, was that true?
Yes, culturally that's not the done thing at all, to uncover your head, to let your hair down. Now, when you think about it, it's actually not very effective. You know, can you imagine it? And can you imagine how many tears it takes to wet a person's feet? And can you imagine what else happens when you cry that much, you know? When you kiss your honey and her nose is kind of runny, you may think it's funny, but it's not. But the whole thing is messy, and it's completely unscripted from her point of view. The interesting thing is here that in every one of those things, coming into this presence of this august religious leader, to do what she's doing, breaks all of the cultural taboos around shame and honour. But something incredibly powerful must have happened in her so that she's no longer worried about those. And it's very clear that she's come there in a premeditated way. We don't know anything else about the story, but reading between the lines, it seems that she has heard Jesus on some other occasion, realised that what he's saying is for her, that there's a new start for people like her, and she's been free of the shame and the associated guilt and other things with it because of this contact that she's had with him. And so she comes to bring the best thing that she can, which is this alabaster vial full of ointment. Very, very expensive thing to bring. Sometimes was saved for the person's own wedding. The sinner label is very intentional. It's an immoral label. It's a label that attaches to prostitution and promiscuity. So the implication is she's actually earned this by those means. And yet this very thing, you know, how many liaisons has it taken to get all of this together? She's now just completely free to pour it all out. And just the sheer physicality of it. You know, Jesus wasn't embarrassed to receive this. But everyone else around the table was. It is a complete reversal of honour, shame categories, status, and so forth. Kirsten was just reminding me that in one of the places we visited overseas, in a very traditional and austere denomination, in one little segment at the back, there was a pew sort of cut off halfway along, and that was the sinner's corner. The people who were under church discipline for having sinned sat in that corner, and they couldn't come to communion and other things. And Kirsten just made the point when we were there, well, that's the very corner that Jesus would sit in.
Well, that's where he'd preach from.
That's
you know,
where
if he was the
from.
pastor.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not ashamed. Anyone else comments on the story from Luke chapter 7?
I think we were the last part. Your faith has saved you, or whatever. The faith. What's the faith? What's her faith? What's she doing? And I guess we felt that she's either going to get absolutely hammered again in public, she's going to be absolutely publicly shamed, as she probably expects, or she's going to be absolutely free. And that's the faith. There's no halfway.
Yep, there's no halfway.
And all she's got is him.
Yep.
Because the rest of them don't get it.
Yep.
And that's all she needs.
Yeah, luckily he's there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask Kirsten to read a poem. We're coming to the end of our session for tonight, but this is a poem that comes from a very real experience. I'll let you give the background in a minute, but one of the areas in which we sometimes find intense shame is about aging, decay, death and dying, and issues related to that. They uncover things that we don't want to face. This is a poem about a real encounter with a real person. I'll let you give the background and then read it, and then we'll close off for the night.
So, who was the poem by? A friend of ours. So, a friend of ours was working in the palliative care ward and was explaining just how confronting some of the illnesses were. And when you think about perhaps tumours, and we call them, horrible name, fungating tumours, and basically they grow, they're not treatable, they're stinky, they're in open view, and you can just imagine, you know, maybe on your face or your neck or your abdomen, and family come and visit, and that they are so stinky, and the nurses try and use antibiotic ointments to try and clean things, and they try and clean the room and spray the room with lavender, and there's music playing, but you just can't hide that sense of perhaps humiliation that the person feels. And when death is so that process of dying is so public and so awful in a way, the patient who's dying can feel so humiliated, and they just want to hide in a corner, and often people are actually tucked away in the corner because it's so socially confronting, even for staff, as loving as they are. The shame that the people themselves feel as they're dying in that way, and that sense of loss of dignity, and what's my life all been about, and it's come to this. And like we said before, that shame is sometimes then attached with anger. That's the anger at God that I don't deserve this. So I think that was the context of the poem. So I'll just read it. I have it. It was emailed to me. It says, "Lord, can't you see how hard I've worked, and I've never asked for pay?" And apparently this was a woman who had throat cancer. She couldn't eat anything, and I think was maybe Italian background, and had loved the food, but then also had contracted one of these nasty contagious viruses and had to be isolated in a ward with other dying patients who had these viruses. No family couldn't come into the room. The doctors all had to wear gloves and masks and gowns, so it's like so robotic and no human contact. Can't you see how hard I've worked, and I've never asked for pay, slaving in the kitchen to serve you night and day? And now, how could you leave me when I've done so much for you, and all I've ever asked for is that you would serve me too? I've done more than the others, and now I'm all alone, left like Jonah in this bitterness when you destroyed his leafy home. I thought that all my deeds would have purchased me much more, but now I see you've left me ragged with less even than the poor. For you have made me bitter, I cannot swallow food, and the doctor dares to tell me that you are kind and good. I tell her you've left me, and she takes off her gloves and gown and holds me by the hand that I once knew as your own. And I tell her you've left me, and she tells me you are love, and smiles at me with tears that are yours shed from above. And I tell her you've left me in this place of living dead, and she tells me of your son abandoned, and that he was left instead. And I whine that you have left me, despite my slavish deeds, and she speaks of your forgiveness and your son who intercedes. And you tell me things I once knew when I was just a little girl, and you tell me that all suffering is a love thing of this world. Though sight will never know it, and now my sight is dim, I catch the Spirit's whisper of you who suffered all my sin. And you tell me by this cancer, you're calling me to home, where you, my bridegroom, will receive me and take me as your own, where you, my Lord, will be my God, and I will worship as your bride. And though Christ, my tender Saviour, never once had left my side.
It's the story of Luke 7 in a different guise, isn't it? Well, the good news is that God is not ashamed of you, not ashamed of any of us, no matter how much we might have been ashamed of him or ashamed of ourselves. So we've come to the end of this session on shame, and that's the end of our 4 weeks in the basement. Thank you for your time and for your attention, and thank you for those who've joined us watching from elsewhere. We hope that this has been a blessing to you, and hope that it's been a blessing to those who've gathered in the basement. The advantage here is, of course, we've had the wine and cheese and the supper, but I'm sure that's not the only reason people have come. But thank you very much, and we'll catch up again soon another time. Bye-bye.